This is really depressing. We try our hardest to produce a wonderful crop that will feed the globe, yet we are hardly able to give it away. The crops are dying on the stalk, not because they have been harvested, which is why fields all over America are becoming quiet. Moreover, 400 million pounds of food were abandoned to decay in September 2025. Soybeans in Illinois are fading unchecked, corn is drying up in Iowa, and tomatoes are falling to the ground in California. The weather isn't the problem. They're not pests. Something in the system appears to be broken right now. Halfway through the harvest, some farmers gave up. But before we get right in, if you're worried about your health, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is where we share the facts that no one talks about. And if you're with me, please let me know. In the comment field, put 1 if you're currently viewing and this video speaks to you. Type 0 otherwise. You are unaware of the significance of your voice. Others were unable to locate enough employees. Some were informed there were no buyers for their crops. Shipments from abroad continue to arrive in the interim. Grocery shop prices continue to rise. What is the reason behind the decline of American-grown food while the nation continues to import more? Why must those who cultivate our food view it with disdain as it dies? We dissect the 7 crops that are now being left to rot in the fields in this video. Keep reading, because the conclusion might reveal more about America than has been previously stated. First place. First, let's talk about corn. Whole towns were created on this crop, the basis for cereals with ethanol sweetener for animal feed. 1,000 other things follow if corn falters. And something isn't keeping steady at the moment. Large areas of cornfields in Nebraska and portions of Iowa showed anomalous discoloration detected by satellite scans in early August. By the middle of September, the pattern had become neither isolated nor random. Stress is uniform over entire fields. A faint rust is appearing on the leaves. The tips are fragile. The cobs were not fully formed. Tar stain and rust in the south. Agronomists are referring to it as such. However, the sickness alone is not the problem. The time is the problem. Farmers were already overburdened when it struck. The cost of applying fungicides had risen since 2 years ago. The price of diesel was close to $6 a gallon. Some had already reduced the amount of time they spent spraying. Others hopped about. It was too late when the warning symptoms appeared. The markets, on the other hand, hardly moved. Futures bounced after dipping. However, what is being harvested on the ground is not what was anticipated. Central Illinois yield reports were 20% lower than expected, insufficient for the first page. However, enough to alter bank loan calculations on feed expenses. Regarding the machinery's payment this year. Brazil, however, recently announced another record crop. Their corn is already on ships and is cleaner and drier. Last week, the Philippines placed a sizable order. Argentina's own incursion into South Korea came next. Buyers are not merely searching temporarily, they are searching elsewhere. By early September, some Midwest grain elevators had begun to restrict inflow, not due to their fullness, but due to the absence of the contracts. In anticipation of a price increase, some grain is being stored in outdated storage bins. However, few can afford the risk, as the likelihood of mold growth is growing every day. What's being left behind is stunning. Even damaged corn may be chopped for silage in a normal year. However, some fields were just ignored this year. Full rows are still standing, browned and unaltered, according to aerial drone imagery from western Kansas. No combines, not a single truck. Just silence. It's difficult to overlook the disconnect. Prices at supermarkets have not decreased. Feedlots continue to pay higher prices. Producers of ethanol are keeping a close eye on the market. However, farmers are staring at rows of goods that will never be sold. Where is it all heading then? You may have observed a slight increase in the cost of products made from corn. Perhaps you haven't. However, crop losses of this type don't always occur where people anticipate them to. It moves slowly. It's silent. Additionally, it spreads underneath the surface. This is a missed harvest, a contract that was canceled there. Then, a factory's input costs increase. A food manufacturer then reduces the volume. Packaging then becomes smaller. Corn is not the end result of all of that. However, occasionally too much of it does. If corn is exhibiting fissures despite all of the federal programs and infrastructure supporting it, It raises questions about the crops that lack such a safety net. The ones that don't store well decay more quickly and bruise readily. And when you begin to question it, you begin to consider the next step. Which other crops are on the same course? Now let's examine soybeans, the king of American exports, so to speak. What occurs, though, when even the monarch is left without a throne? Second place, soybeans. The figures don't stand out, they mutter. As of late September, only 3 million metric tons of soybeans had been sold for export. It appears to be a delay on paper, it's a signal in practice. Once worth billions of dollars in a single season, the crop now sits in bins unclaimed and uncontracted. There are no lines at the ports. Do not rush the loading of containers. Again, only silence. In the past, soybeans were the key. They were the foundation of entire agricultural budgets from Ohio to the Dakotas. Tofu, oil processing, feed markets, biodiesel, and so forth. And the desire seemed to be insatiable for years. Calls from Asia, however, decreased to a trickle this fall. The biggest buyer, China, hasn't placed any noteworthy fresh orders. They're reportedly stockpiling elsewhere. Brazil is less expensive. Argentina provides expedited shipping. As a result, American soy is motionless, and there's a cost to that silence. Storage space is being reduced by certain elevators, not due to a lack of volume, but rather to a lack of turnover. Soybean bins are being filled to capacity due to stalled contracts and backed up shipping routes, and the dangers increase when beans are left out for too long. Wetness accumulates, temperatures change, the quality declines. Premium-grade cargo begins to veer toward animal feed value and then into loss. Ironically, the fields still appear to be full. It can appear like everything is fine if you drive by them. That's the problem with soybeans, though. The harm is not audible. It infiltrates through lost deadlines, declining profit margins, increased storage expenses, and foreign purchasers ceasing to answer the phone. For many mid-sized farms, futures fell below break-even this month. It doesn't garner media attention, however it manifests in many ways. Payments for equipment are delayed, orders for fertilizer are declining. The number of acres scheduled for the upcoming season is reduced. Eventually, some farmers choose not to participate, not of farming in general, but of soybeans in particular, as they simply cannot afford to lose again. It took time for it to happen. Confidence has been eroded over the past 5 years by trade conflicts, fluctuating tariffs, erratic inspections, and rival export agreements. It appeared to be a brief change at first, followed by a more significant modification. And for other people, it no longer appears to be transient. The effects are not limited to the farm. Hundreds of processed items are made with soybean oil. Food producers search for alternatives when prices become unstable. Thus, a feedback loop is produced. Demand declines. Customers are hesitant. The bins hold more beans. You may sense the fall without a crash. Just enough hesitancy. Not enough maybes. Enough cargoes were diverted. It's not the loss that's haunting. The uncertainty is the problem. Every harvest is plagued by questions. Will it last long enough for anyone to purchase? Will things be different next year? The globe continues to move despite everything. Ships dock. Containers are mobile. Shops maintain inventory. However, behind those shelves, farmers gaze along rows of goods that may no longer be in demand on the world market, not at a cost that pays anyway. When people start sourcing from other places, what will happen? It's not just corn when something that initially felt like a blip becomes to feel like a routine. It's not just soybeans either. Cracks are also seen in crops that decay quickly. Crops where days rather than months are used to measure time. Crops such as tomatoes. Because you begin to worry what else might be breaking when even the softest fruit fails to make it from farm to table. Third, without tomatoes, pizza sauce would not be possible, or ketchup, or chili. Or that soup in a can that has been in your pantry since the previous winter. You can find tomatoes in your drive-through bag, in your freezer, and in your weeknight meals. However, tomatoes that fell across farms in the Central Valley of California did not reach the truck. They parted ways, they went down. They decayed. The inflow of processors began to slow in late August. The orders weren't coming in, not because the tomatoes weren't ripe. Bakersfield and Stockton warehouses were filled weeks before they were supposed to. Some plants cut back on shifts. Others advised farmers to postpone deliveries. All it takes for a tomato to fall apart in the field is that delay. Tomatoes don't wait like corn or soy does. The clock begins to tick as soon as they reach peak color. The difference between compost and premium sauce material can be as little as 36 hours. Additionally, this season's delays were longer. Trucks sat motionless. They sent picking crews home early. Under the September sun, thousands of tons were left to melt in rows. The cost of canned tomatoes at the grocer hasn't decreased. However, for the upcoming year, processors are reducing their contracts. Canceled renewals are being reported by certain growers. They're asking others to reduce their acreage. And as of right now, food shelves remain stocked. That's the confusing part, though. When farms are being abandoned, how can shelves remain stocked? To make up the difference, some firms are importing paste from abroad: Turkey, Italy, and possibly China. Sometimes labels don't convey the whole picture. Although the contents give a different impression, you may believe that you are purchasing California-grown. Additionally, foreign paste enters the system when domestic tomatoes are left unpicked. Not less expensive, not any better, simply more accessible. And things begin to change at that point. California tomatoes help more than only the farm. Truck drivers, processors, workers on factory lines, label printers, and warehouse employees are all impacted. The effects of skipping a crop extend well beyond the land. 2 fewer pallets there, 1 missing load here. Someone then fails to receive their hours a week later, or their salary. The effects come gradually but steadily. Loan requests are declining for regional banks. Softer fall sales are being reported by equipment vendors. Deliveries to fuel sellers in the Central Valley have decreased by 10%. It doesn't feel very big. It speaks louder than any headline, though, when you consider everything. What about quality? Overexposure was evident in some of the picked tomatoes. The sun burns. Fractures. Uneven ripeness. Discounts were paid to processors. A few containers were completely rejected. Insufficient constancy. The freight is not worth it. Furthermore, each acre that is squandered represents not just a lost crop, but also a wasted resource because water supplies are more limited than ever. When prices increase, people take notice. The difference between what is being grown and what is being used, however, is something people fail to notice. The gentle loss. The quiet departure. The kind that lurks in the system yet doesn't appear on receipts. No one is alarmed by a tomato that gets misplaced in the field. However, it begins to feel as though something is cracking after thousands of acres like that. What does that suggest for crops with even narrower margins if tomatoes, which are essential to so many of our foods, are being allowed to rot? Fourth, grapes. This autumn, the air in grape country in California feels different. Though not from celebration, the sweetness is still present. It comes from grapes that aren't fermented in barrels but rather in the sun, on the earth. Vineyards in Madera and Fresno reported a dramatic decline in active purchasers by the beginning of September. New contracts are retracted by wineries. Shipments are halted by juice processors. Even producers of dried fruit began to restrict consumption. It was not a freeze that occurred. There was no drought. There was fruit. The directives weren't. First things went wrong for table grapes. In late August, a flood of lower-priced imports from Mexico and South America filled distribution centers. Retailers began prioritizing predictability over loyalty as a result of rising transportation costs and unpredictable demand. Pallets of perfectly ripened, ready-to-pack grapes grown in the United States, therefore, never made it aboard the truck. Early on, vineyards began to pull pickers. It was because the work was not worth the loss, not because the fruit was overripe. Halfway through rows, crews were instructed to stop. A few didn't even get going. Drone footage taken in the middle of the month showed acres of unharvested grapes fading to black and falling to the ground. Grapes don't give second chances as other crops do. Delay turns to decay if they hit a particular sugar level. And this season's postponement became the norm. The demand for bulk wine is changing in the meantime. Lower-cost blends are being offered by European producers. Asia is shifting its investments to homegrown wine. The ripple is obvious. As fewer American wines are sold overseas, fewer grapes are required domestically. Reduced processing, not as much bottling, more dumping. It's not only wine here. Everything from school lunches and snack packs to juices and jellies is made using grapes. In the background, however, processors subtly revealed reductions to their 2026 intake projections. Staff reductions are being discussed by Napa and Sonoma cooperatives. Some are even allowing employees to retire early. Not even high-end brands are exempt. According to reports, a well-known sparkling juice company rejected 20s of its usual supply this quarter. Why not due to quality? But because fewer orders were placed by retailers. Additionally, they were unwilling to take on additional stock as margins tightened. The pressure from pests also intensified at the same time. More residual fruit was left uncovered in vineyards when fewer grapes were harvested. Insects were drawn to that. Mold was introduced by that. Early season burning was a tactic used by certain farmers. Others just walked away after cutting the losses. The dinner table has not yet witnessed any of this. Grapes are still sold at supermarkets. The wine racks appear to be filled. However, the statistics behind the scenes paint a different picture. Exports of grapes from California decreased by over 15% from the previous year. There is an 8% decrease in domestic processing. Time also costs thousands of tons of fruit that could have been used. This type of collapse does not cause market collapses. It is more silent, like turning down the volume knob every year. Reduced self-assurance, less acres, shorter agreements. They are all pointing in the same way. What comes next then? What will happen to fruits that deteriorate even more quickly and bruise before being boxed if grapes, a crop with centuries of history, worldwide appeal, and year-round demand, are quietly withdrawing from the competition? Ones that farmers must leave in a matter of hours. Strawberry number 5. Not all losses are noisy. They simply disappear into the soft soil. That's what happened in the strawberry belt of California this season. Whole ripe fruit patches never saw a box, never came into contact with cold storage, and never made it to the shelves, merely withered. Reports from Ventura and Santa Cruz counties by the middle of September revealed a trend that nobody wanted to verify. Not illness, not a drought. Although there weren't as many hands to pick them as anticipated, the strawberries were flawless. There were fewer picking crews. A few farms were only using 30% of their potential. Others completely stopped harvesting. Instead of losing more money on labor freight and lost contracts, a silent decision let it rot. Silence like that has weight, particularly when it comes to strawberries. These crops are not hardy. They lose their hold once ripened. Even an 8-hour delay results in bruises. Mold appears after 2 days. It's over after 3 days. The field becomes bitter. Those timelines repeatedly came to pass this year. And it's not just a loss for agriculture when that much fruit rots. It's a domino effect. Distributors of fresh fruit cut orders in the background. Soft demand was cited by exporters. Shelf space was decreased by regional stores. Cheaper berries from abroad discreetly filled the void left by local buyers pulling back foreign shipments. Unless you read the fine print, you wouldn't be aware of it. Many don't. Furthermore, it goes beyond berries in a box. Strawberries are used in a variety of products, including protein bars, yogurt cups, and bakery fillings. First, processors are affected by a decrease in availability, followed by consumers. Smaller containers, thinner strata, missing things from well-known menus. Thousands of pounds of fresh strawberries that were grown only a few miles away remained stationary throughout this time. Growers are being advised to reduce their operations. The production of seedlings for next year has already been drastically reduced by some nurseries. Citing low labor certainty, others are terminating contracts. Furthermore, the discussions between farmers and processors, packers, and shippers are no longer about expansion. They are about using less to survive the next cycle. This crop is not protected by price either. Strawberries were more expensive in some places than they were the previous season. However, without labor, infrastructure, and a guarantee of high prices from buyers, the loss will only get worse. Because strawberries that aren't harvested don't generate income. They end up as waste. The field also remembers. Spoiled fruit spreads disease, weakens vines, and draws pests. A missed harvest puts the following season in jeopardy in addition to hurting this one. This collapse was not announced, not a single headline. The produce section had no warning signs. Fruit is just missing. After that, there was a feeling that a subtle but significant change had occurred in the system, and it doesn't end with strawberries, because Americans consume fruits on a daily basis if this is possible. What about the greens that we eat with every meal? Sixth, leafy greens. The shelf life of lettuce is short, days, no, hours. Leafy greens collapse under their own moisture after harvest. That's why the smell started this fall in some areas of Yuma and Salinas. Then there are the flies. Then there was quiet. By 10 in the morning, fields that were meant to be harvested by 6 were still unpicked. Rows of iceberg and romaine were already beginning to wilt by midday. Trucks that were supposed to deliver fresh greens to packing sheds were either left waiting or rerouted. In certain instances, no one arrived to load. The weather wasn't the issue here. Soil was not the issue. The narrowest margin in American agriculture was finally collapsing. Timelines for leafy greens have always been extremely tight. Make a cut today, ship this evening, stocked by morning. If you miss that window, the crop will be lost. However, that window shut even more tightly this year. Some buyers postponed orders by 1 day due to the increase in freight costs. Entire acres could have been destroyed by that alone. Farmers needed to make decisions quickly. Cut early to avoid spoiling and transportation risks. Cut late and you could lose everything. Some didn't even cut. The greens were left on the ground and allowed to decompose where they were, not due to carelessness, from reason. Moving them was more expensive than letting them rot. Customers also observed something else while this was happening in the fields: fewer salads in bags. There are more indications that spring mix and baby spinach are out of stock, smaller bundles, increased costs. However, they were blind to what went on behind the scenes. Silently, regional distributors reduced their operations. Packing houses cut down on hours. Compressors in cold storage facilities were turned off to conserve energy. Every link in the chain reduced expenses and employees. The contracts followed. Institutional orders were reduced by major food service buyers. Menus for school lunch providers were modified. The airline reduced its catering. While acres of ready greens broke down in the soil upstream, every layer downstream from the farm became more compacted. By late September, the losses extended beyond agriculture. They had a structure. Transportation bottlenecks and labor shortages collided. Margin was impacted by fuel prices. Foreign greens that were cultivated according to lower standards began to show up more frequently. Not any better. Simply put, it's easier to move. And silence in the midst of it all. Not a single headline. There is no breaking news. It's just a subtle change in what can be grown and what can't. Number 7. Almonds. Almonds used to represent growth in California's Central Valley. Miles upon miles of precisely aligned trees that promised profits. Slow but steady. Dependable but not ostentatious. However, that promise fell apart this season. Processors started issuing overstock warnings in early August. Almonds that had not been sold during the previous 2 seasons were piled high in warehouses. Demand abroad decreased. Trade routes became more constrained. American almonds were more difficult to defend on international shelves due to shipping costs. Even seasoned consumers in Europe and India resorted to less expensive options. Stocks in Australia rose sharply. California almonds waited in the interim. Additionally, you cannot pause this crop. Unlike lettuce or strawberries, almonds never go out of style. These trees need ongoing maintenance, including labor, pollination, water, and nutrients. And the damage is evident quickly, not only in the yield this year but also in the quality of the bloom the following year, if a grower retreats even a little. Therefore, thousands of acres were left to dry out this summer when prices fell below break-even, not by chance, as a choice. Orchards that had been tended for more than 10 years were being torn out by farmers. Others demolished whole areas. Some just shut off the water. Large brown patches among greenery were seen in aerial footage by the end of September. These were not caused by drought, but rather by abandonment. Then came the figures. Exports experienced a double-digit decline. Contracts with domestic snack manufacturers were postponed. Alternative nuts started to be blended into some almond milk brands. Silently, without much fanfare, enough to bring the cost back into balance. Nothing appears to be missing from grocery aisles. There is still almond butter available. Almonds are still listed on granola bags. However, the supply chain is getting smaller behind that facade of normalcy. The one that sheds growers. Infrastructure compression. Losing faith. And many of the people who are left are getting older. A lot of people are exhausted. For some, walking is just one bad season away. Because almonds are more than just a cost consideration. Time is of the essence, waiting for trees to reach maturity. Recuperation time following a market crash. Some people's time ran out. Irrigation companies began to take notice. Lower orders of water. Fewer new systems were set up. Almond operations were identified as high risk by insurance adjusters. The value of land changed. Investors pulled out. Almonds were still sitting in crates, unshipped and undesired. This collapse was not covered by any news cycle. It was the opposite, not in a storm, not with flames. However, quiet math showed that this was no longer the case. Thus, when the growers vanish but the shelves remain stocked, what is actually lost? Because almonds, one of the most processed, exported, and embedded crops in America, are disappearing from the map. What else is leaving already? We have now arrived at the end of the list. However, the issue is not resolved. We take a step back to see the big picture in the next section. Most people miss the signs and patterns. Remain with us. So far, you have only seen the symptom. The hardest part to acknowledge is that none of this occurred overnight. Crops don't go bad overnight. Markets don't suddenly freeze. Furthermore, farmers don't just quit because they want to. The corn, standing soybeans, unshipped strawberries, wasted greens, withering almonds, and bulldoze that we just witnessed are not all distinct issues. One slow breakdown at a time, layer by layer, field by field. Perhaps the tariffs are to blame. The trade routes might be the cause. Perhaps it's the expense of operating in a system where producing food generates less revenue than discarding it. However, the cause has no bearing on the result. America's agricultural output is astounding, silently, invisible. We all underestimate how close we are to it. It's time to consider how much more can rot before the next farm becomes quiet and the next aisle becomes empty. Prior to the system itself. Remember to share if this gave you pause. Because it's not just food that's going bad, it's faith. And it doesn't grow back once that's gone. Conversation centered on social trends, public opinion, and current events. We adhere strictly to all federal laws and the U.S. Constitution. Please leave a comment if today's analysis got you thinking so we can continue the discussion. To ensure you don't miss our next independent in-depth analysis, remember to hit the bell, like, and subscribe.